Donald Barrett Danner, and it's always a wonderful experience when we have an opportunity to talk about our families and to talk about this wonderful Albion Valley, a place that's dear to all of us. My roots run quite deep in this valley. On my grandfather and grandmother Danner's side, she was a Lewis, came here, and I recall in the mid-1870s, 1875 in that area. My grandfather Danner came here in the late 1870s. He came up out of Texas bringing cattle up to this part of the country, and somehow ended up here in Albion. On my grandfather and grandmother side, on my mother's side of the family, they were immigrants from England that came to the United States in the 1890s. Settled first on the Portneuf River in Pocatello, where they had a small dairy, and then they traded that dairy for property here in Albion, 80 acres. It was owned by Mr. Weatherman. It's the property where George and Kelly and his family now live here in Albion. Both of my parents, Heber Harry Danner and Ellen Barrett Danner, were born here in Albion. My dad was born on the old homestead at the base of Mount Harrison. My mother out on the ranch where the Kellys now live. I was born during the Depression years also. During those years, why, work was a little hard to come by, and my dad had found work in California manufacturing concrete pipe for a company there, and so they had gone to California, and I was born there December the 19th, 1930. Came back to Albion, I think, when I was 18 months old, and lived here in a variety of places. We first came back as a youngster. We lived in the basement of my grandparents, Edward and Alice Barrett, out on the old ranch, and I recall being here in those years when we had the earthquake here in Albion. I can remember standing on the steps of the basement there when the trees and the ground just were kind of rolling. Some of the other experiences I can recall as a youngster before I started school was, in those days, the valley was being overrun by jackrabbits. They were eating the crops and anything else that they could find, I guess. And so everyone would gather up, and we would have what I guess they called a rabbit drive. They would go out at night and form a big circle with the cars around, and that with the lights on, and form a big circle, and then just tighten that circle together. And then they would get all the rabbits in this circle, and then they would let the kids go in there and with clubs and that, and kill the rabbits. We'd probably be locked up for doing that today. The Humane Society would probably arrest us all, but in those days it was a matter of either the rabbits or the people, and so we killed the rabbits. I recall in those early days before I started school that there were great activities here in the community. In those days there was a rod and gun club here. I guess my dad and one of my uncles, Bill Barrett, were affiliated with that somehow. I don't know whether they were officers or what, but every 4th of July there was a big celebration here in Albion, and had the parades then as we do now. And I remember that one of the activities was a boxing match between Doyle Butler, we all refer to him as Tarzan Butler, and Richardson from Deco. I must have been about 3 then, I guess, and so they were in the ring fighting, and Richardson hooked Doyle over the eye and cut his eye and was bleeding, and I was bawling. I thought Doyle had been killed. And I was very upset. I guess the other thing I remember that upset me was my first haircut in Roy Bird's barber shop. which Kay just mentioned a minute ago, was down there by what used to be the J.C. Cafe and the Hepworth Meat Market. It was in between there by the millinery shop. It took about 2 or 3 of them to hold me down to get my hair cut, that first one, so that was quite an experience. I remember in those days at the intersection there by the old courthouse, later Hager's store, and on the other corner was the Ingle King Satchel service station, and I don't know whether it was a machine shop or garage, but Bill Satchel and Frank Ingle King run that. And as Kay said, over on the other corner there had been the Mercantile, and in those days it was just a vacant lot. And then of course the Hager store on the other corner. And right in the center of that intersection was a flagpole. As I recall it, there was a large concrete pad that flagpole set on. Keith and some of you maybe remember that better than I do, but I remember that flagpole being right in the intersection in those days. I can't remember when they took it down, but it's no longer there.
It's over at the school. It's at the school.
Is it?
Yeah.
I guess one of the other things I remember before starting school was going down to Doc Sater's house, which is the home where Rick Mahoney now lives. Doc Sater had his practice there, and Doc Trainer would come in and they would take tonsils and adenoids out for kids that needed it. And so I can remember in that front room of the old Doc Sater's house being down there and going in there to get my tonsils and adenoids out. So those are a few of the things that I remember early on in my life here in this valley. It's a wonderful, wonderful place to live. Those that like the beauty of the mountains and the surrounding area and the Lake Cleveland and the streams and that, I can remember as a young child when my father still had to carry me after work. He and Parley Powell and Del Rowe and Riley Gray and Jakey Baumgartner, that would go up to Lake Cleveland, and they'd fish up there after work in the evening, sometimes till after dark. And then we had to walk in to get into the lake in those days, and so then they'd carry me out of there to get back up to the cars to come home. So that was some great memories for me early on in my life here in this valley. I started school before I was 5. I guess I was still 4. And Miss Berg, which you have heard of earlier, didn't want me to start school. So my mother and her had a few parent-teacher conferences. And finally she decided that, yeah, I could start school. At that time, we were living out on the old Melcher place, which is later became known as the Adams place, where Sterling and Pearl Adams lived and raised their family. Prior to that, we had lived on the old in the old Bridger house that lived was down here in town, and it's set out in front of where Edith Carlson's home was at, under those big cottonwood trees. That old house has been moved across the street in the field. I think most of you are familiar with where that old house still sits. Well, that was owned by John and Kate Bridger in those days, and we lived there for a while, and then moved up to the Melcher place, and later on my folks bought 40 acres out on the corner just east of where the current LDS church is located. Starting kindergarten under Miss Berg was an experience that all who have gone through that, I know, never forget. And so I think that I'll stop there with my starting school and add on to that later on.